Welcome back to another episode of Boring History for Sleep. Before we begin our long journey into the world of the Roman legion, I want you to take a moment to get comfortable. Find your blanket, settle in, and let your body relax. This is a place for calm storytelling, a steady voice, and gentle history that helps you rest. While you are here, don't forget to subscribe so you can join us every time we wander through the past. Leave a comment to let us know where in the world you are listening from, because it is always wonderful to see how far our little community reaches. Now that you are wrapped up, calm, and ready, let's step quietly into the world of the Roman legion, a machine of discipline and order that marched across history. Why you wouldn't last a day as a Roman soldier. Imagine yourself standing in the hot sun, your feet already sore, a heavy pack strapped across your shoulders. The pack weighs about 30 kilograms. Inside it you carry your tools, your food, your spare clothes, and sometimes even stones or wooden stakes to build a camp at night. You feel the leather straps digging into your shoulders. The road stretches ahead, long and dry. You have been walking for hours, and you know there are hours still to come. This was the life of a Roman soldier on the march. While people today imagine shining armor and heroic battles, most of the time a soldier's life was about walking. Mile after mile, day after day, carrying loads that bent their backs and rubbed their skin raw. Even their sandals, called calligi, left their feet covered in blisters. The soles were studded with iron nails, meant to last, but they made every step feel heavy. Soldiers were expected to walk more than 20 miles a day, and sometimes even more if orders demanded it. When the day's march ended, the work did not stop. Soldiers were not allowed to simply sit down and rest. Instead, they had to build a camp. Every night, no matter how tired they were, the army dug trenches, set up wooden walls, and prepared guard posts. Each soldier had his duty. Some carried spades, others carried baskets for earth, and others hauled the wooden stakes that would become the camp fence. The digging made their hands ache, the dirt filled their sandals, and yet no one was excused. A Roman army never slept without its camp, because safety came before comfort. Food was plain and simple. Soldiers often ate a kind of porridge made from wheat, mixed with water, and sometimes flavored with a little salt or vinegar. Meat was rare except during special occasions, or if they hunted animals along the road. They drank water if it was clean, or sour wine mixed with water to kill off germs. Imagine lifting your bowl of thin porridge after such a long march. The taste was not exciting, but it filled the stomach, and that was enough. The armor itself was another burden. The helmet, made of bronze or iron, pressed down on the head. The shield, a large rectangle of wood and leather, weighed around 10 kilograms. Add a sword at the waist, a dagger, and sometimes a spear or javelin, and you begin to understand how heavy the soldier's load truly was. Modern people often think they could step into the sandals of a legionnaire. But after just an hour of walking under such weight, most would beg to sit down. And yet the soldiers endured. The Roman army was famous for discipline. If a man fell behind on the march, he could be punished. If he disobeyed an order, the punishment could be severe, even cruel. Fear kept them in line, but so did habit. After months and years of service, a soldier's body became used to the routine. The rhythm of marching, digging, eating, sleeping, and waking became the only rhythm he knew. Life was not glamorous. There were no soft beds, no sweet fruits, and no gold coins showered on ordinary men. The glory that Roman poets sang about was reserved for generals and emperors. For the common soldier, life was about enduring hardship quietly. You can almost hear it now. The crunch of sandals on gravel. The murmur of voices as men march side by side. The sound of tools striking earth as the camp rises in the twilight. It was not the story of one day or one battle, but of countless days that looked almost the same. And that is why you would not last a single day as a Roman soldier. The body would ache, the blisters would sting, the weight of the armor would feel unbearable. The demands of discipline would leave no space for rest. But for the men of Rome, this was life, day after day, season after season. As we leave behind the dust of the march and the tired footsteps of common soldiers, let us turn to one of the most famous names in Roman history. A man who rose from soldier to general, and from general to ruler. His story is not just about battles, but about ambition, politics, and the fall of a republic. This is the story of Julius Caesar. The rise and fall of Julius Caesar. Imagine a man standing in the Forum of Rome. He wears a simple white toga, yet all eyes turn to him. His voice is calm, his words chosen with care, but there is strength behind every sentence. This is Gaius Julius Caesar, one of the most famous figures in Roman history. His name has become a symbol of power itself, but his life was filled with both triumph and danger. To understand Caesar, we must begin not with his victories but with his background. He was born in 100 BCE, into a family that was noble but not the richest in Rome. His family claimed descent from the goddess Venus, which gave him a sense of destiny. Yet in his youth, Caesar had no guarantees. The Roman Republic was a dangerous place, full of rival politicians, sudden violence, and shifting alliances. As a young man, Caesar served in the army. He learned how to march, how to fight, and how to command respect. He also traveled abroad, sometimes in exile, sometimes on duty. Stories were told of him refusing to bow to pirates who once captured him. Instead, he promised that when he was free, he would return and punish them. He kept that promise. This mixture of boldness and careful calculation would mark his entire career. Caesar rose in politics step by step. He became known as a skilled speaker, someone who could sway a crowd with calm words. He also became famous for generosity. He often spent more than he could afford, hosting games and festivals that entertained the people. By doing this, he gained popularity. Many politicians looked down on him for his debts and bold style, but the people of Rome admired him. His military career soon lifted him to even greater heights. When he was given command in Gaul, the region that includes modern France and Belgium, Caesar saw an opportunity. For nearly a decade, he led Roman legions across rivers and mountains, conquering tribes and expanding Rome's borders. His soldiers grew loyal to him. They marched where he ordered, they fought with discipline, and they brought him victories that made him rich and powerful. But power always comes with a price. Back in Rome, senators grew uneasy. They feared that Caesar's victories were making him too strong. They worried that he would use his army to control politics, breaking the traditions of the Republic. Among those who watched him with suspicion was another general, Pompey, who had once been Caesar's ally. The friendship between Caesar and Pompey turned into rivalry. Tensions grew. At last, Caesar was ordered to give up his army and return to Rome as a private citizen. To do so would have meant humiliation and possibly trial. Instead, in 49 BCE, Caesar made a choice that would change history. He led his army across a small river called the Rubicon. This act was a declaration of war against the Senate itself. From that moment, there was no going back. Civil war followed. Caesar moved quickly and decisively. He defeated Pompey's forces in battle after battle, chasing him across Greece, Egypt, and Africa. In Egypt, Caesar became entangled in the politics of the royal court, supporting Queen Cleopatra in her own struggle for power. The image of Caesar and Cleopatra together has inspired stories for centuries, though in truth their connection was as much about politics as romance. When Caesar returned to Rome, he was the most powerful man in the city. He was given the title of dictator, at first for 1 year, then for 10, and finally for life. For many, this looked like the end of the Republic. Senators who believed in the old traditions felt that Caesar was becoming a king in all but name. At the same time, Caesar made changes that won him admiration. He reformed the calendar, creating the Julian calendar, that is the ancestor of the one we use today. He began projects to settle veterans, improve the city, and extend Roman citizenship. He was energetic, ambitious, and always planning more. But his growing power alarmed many. A group of senators, some of whom had once been his allies, began to whisper about protecting the Republic. They believed that if Caesar lived, Rome would lose its freedom. They planned his death not with passion, but with the calm belief that it was necessary. On the Ides of March, the 15th day of the month, in the year 44 BCE, Caesar entered the Senate. It was a normal day. He wore a red robe, and he sat in his chair as usual. Then, suddenly, the conspirators gathered around him. One by one, they struck. Ancient writers tell us that Caesar tried to resist, but when he saw one of his friends, Brutus, among them, he covered his face with his toga. Within moments, the man who had marched across Gaul and reshaped Rome lay dead on the Senate floor. The death of Caesar did not save the Republic. Instead, it opened the door to more years of war. His supporters and his enemies fought for control. Eventually, his adopted heir Octavian, who later took the name Augustus, became the first emperor of Rome. The Republic was gone, and the empire had begun. Caesar's story is one of rise and fall, of ambition and betrayal. His name became so powerful that later rulers, from the German Kaiser to the Russian Tsar, took titles based on it. And yet, when you strip away the myths, Caesar was still a man, walking the same forum, speaking in the same Senate, and making choices that led him to glory and to death. Now, as we leave behind the life and death of Julius Caesar, let us turn from politics and ambition to something quieter, but equally mysterious. A wall of stone stretching across the northern edge of Britain. A wall that marked the edge of Rome's power. Our next step takes us to Hadrian's Wall, and to the question of what it was really for. The mystery of Hadrian's Wall. What was it really for? Picture the wind across the hills of northern Britain. The grass bends, the sky hangs low, and a long stone wall stretches across the land like a silent line drawn by human hands. This is Hadrian's Wall. It has stood for nearly 2,000 years, cutting across the island from the River Tyne in the east to the Solway Firth in the west. But why was it built, and what did it mean? Hadrian's Wall was named after the Emperor Hadrian, who ruled Rome from 117 to 138 CE. Unlike some of his predecessors, Hadrian was not focused on conquering new lands. Instead, he believed in securing the borders of the empire. He traveled widely, visiting the far corners of Rome's territory, and when he reached Britain, he saw that the northern edge was unstable. Tribes lived beyond the frontier. They did not bow to Rome, and they sometimes attacked Roman settlements. So Hadrian ordered a wall. Not a thin fence, but a massive stone structure, nearly 80 miles long. In places, it stood about 15 feet high and 10 feet wide. Every mile, there was a small fort called a mile castle, and between them were even smaller watchtowers. Larger forts were built at regular intervals, each one housing hundreds of soldiers. Building the wall was a huge task. Soldiers from legions stationed in Britain carried stones, cut timber, and dug ditches. They worked in all weather, laying stone on stone mile after mile. The wall was not just a barrier. In front of it ran a deep ditch, and behind it lay a road so that troops could move quickly. The structure itself was both practical and symbolic. But what was the wall really for? Some people think it was built to keep out enemies, like a giant defense line. Others believe it was more about control. The wall helped Rome manage movement across the border. People could pass through, but only at certain gates. Taxes could be collected, goods inspected, and troublemakers watched. The wall also sent a message. It showed that Rome's power had a clear edge. Beyond the wall lay the unknown, a land of tribes and danger. Inside the wall lay order, roads, towns, and Roman law. In this way, the wall was not just a structure of stone. It was a statement. Life along the wall was not easy. Soldiers posted there lived far from the warm cities of Italy. They faced cold winds, rain, and long stretches of quiet duty. They stood watch in towers, patrolled the paths, and trained each day. They lit signal fires if there was trouble, and they drilled with weapons even during calm seasons. The forts along the wall became small communities. Inside the stone walls were barracks, storage rooms, kitchens, and even bathhouses. The smell of wood smoke rose from the fires. The sound of boots on stone echoed through the narrow streets. Merchants set up shops nearby, selling bread, wine, and wool. Local women and children lived in small houses close to the forts, forming tiny towns. Even so, the sense of isolation was strong. The soldiers stationed there were often from faraway places, such as Syria, Spain, or the Balkans. They brought their own languages and customs, and they wrote letters home that spoke of homesickness. The wall was a lonely place, but it was also a place where cultures met. Today, many questions about the wall remain. Archaeologists have uncovered parts of it, studied its layout, and found objects left behind by the people who lived there. Wooden writing tablets, shoes, tools, and even graffiti scratched into the stones give us glimpses of life long ago. Some scholars now believe the wall was not meant to keep people out completely, but to create a controlled border zone. It allowed Rome to regulate trade, monitor local tribes, and show strength without constantly sending out armies. Whatever the exact purpose, the wall has endured. It has become a symbol of the edge of Rome. Standing there today, with the wind in your ears and the stone beneath your hands, you can almost feel the presence of the past. You can imagine the soldiers on watch, the merchants haggling, the travelers passing through the gates. The rhythm of their lives, shaped by the wall, was steady and slow. And so Hadrian's Wall stands not only as a line of defense, but as a reminder. A reminder that even the greatest empires need boundaries. That control is often built not just with swords, but with stone. And that the people who guarded those stones lived lives of patience, routine, and quiet endurance. Now, as we turn away from the wall and its lonely watchtowers, let us step into a very different world. The world of Rome's political elite. For while soldiers stood guard on the empire's edge, senators in the capital walked marble halls, made speeches, and played games of power. In our next segment, we will explore the life of a Roman senator and discover how he managed to do so little while appearing to do so much. Close your eyes and imagine a marble hall in Rome. Sunlight falls through open spaces, catching on white stone columns. Men in long togas stroll slowly, speaking in calm voices, their words measured but often sharp. This is the world of the Roman Senate, the body that claimed to guide Rome even as generals and emperors took much of the real power. To be a senator was to belong to an elite class, one that lived very differently from the common soldier. At first glance, the life of a senator seemed full of duty. Senators were supposed to debate laws, guide policy, and protect the traditions of the Republic, and later, advise the emperors of the empire. They sat in the Senate House, called the Curia, which echoed with speeches. Some senators were excellent speakers, trained in rhetoric from a young age. Their words were like weapons, carefully shaped to win an argument or cut down an opponent. Yet, in truth, many senators spent much of their lives avoiding hard work. While soldiers dug ditches, senators leaned on cushions. They lived in large houses with tiled floors, painted walls, and gardens full of fountains. Slaves cooked their meals, cleaned their homes, and carried messages for them. The daily struggle of survival that burdened ordinary Romans was softened for the senatorial class. Much of a senator's day involved appearances. In the morning, he might receive visitors at home. Clients, poorer men who depended on his support, would line up outside his door. They greeted him with respect, and in return he might offer small gifts, jobs, or simply his name to back their requests. This system, called patronage, kept Roman society tied together. But for the senator, it was also a performance. Later in the day, he might walk to the forum, where public life unfolded. Here he could be seen talking to fellow senators, strolling past temples, or sitting in judgment on legal cases. The forum was not only a place of work, but also of display. A senator's dignity, his gravitas, mattered more than the actual labor he performed. To look busy, to look important, was often enough. Meals were another part of the life of leisure. While soldiers ate porridge in wooden bowls, senators reclined on couches at banquets. A proper Roman dinner could last for hours, with several courses of food. There might be roasted meats, fish from distant seas, olives, honey cakes, and wine mixed with water. Musicians might play softly while servants brought trays of food. Conversation flowed, sometimes about politics, sometimes about poetry, sometimes about nothing at all. But senators did have duties they could not ignore. They were expected to fund games, festivals, and public works. A wealthy senator might pay for a new temple or aqueduct. He might sponsor gladiatorial shows, which entertained the public and won him favor. These acts were expensive, but they bought popularity and prestige. In this way, senators could dodge work by spending money instead of time. Some senators truly tried to influence the empire. They argued in the Curia, they wrote laws, they stood against emperors when they dared. But many others preferred to keep their heads down, avoiding risk. When emperors grew suspicious, senators often hurried to flatter them, pretending loyalty even when they secretly disagreed. Survival mattered more than principle. It is striking to compare the senator's life to that of the soldier. One dug ditches at night to build a camp, his hands rough with calluses. The other reclined on a couch, dictating letters while a servant massaged his feet. One walked miles each day, carrying his gear. The other was carried through the city on a litter, shaded from the sun. Both were Roman, both served the empire, but their daily realities could not have been more different. The senator's rhythm was slow and smooth. He moved from home to forum, from banquet to bath, his life full of comfort and show. Yet beneath this calm surface was always a risk. A senator who angered the emperor might be sent into exile, his property taken, his family shamed. For all their wealth, senators lived with a quiet fear. Power in Rome was always unstable, and the line between leisure and danger was thin. So while it may seem that senators dodged work, they were also caught in a careful game. They balanced appearances, wealth, loyalty, and caution. They lived lives of display rather than labor, but even their privileges came with risks. Now, as we leave behind the shaded courtyards and long banquets of Rome's political elite, let us return to the hard ground of the army. For the next part of our journey takes us back to the training field. where new soldiers were shaped by discipline, pain, and endless repetition. Legionnaire training, pain, pain, and more pain. Imagine the sound of wood striking wood, again and again, a steady rhythm echoing across an open field. This is not a carpenter's workshop. It is the training ground of the Roman army, where recruits were shaped into legionnaires. Life as a soldier did not begin with glory, but with pain. Training was harsh, repetitive, and often more tiring than real battle. From the moment a recruit joined, discipline ruled his life. His first task was not to learn swordplay, but to march. Soldiers marched for hours in full gear, often carrying heavy packs. They learned to move as one, step after step, until their bodies ached. The Roman army believed that marching was the foundation of victory. If an army could move quickly and arrive in order, it could win before the battle even began. Weapons training came next, but even here, the army made it harder than it needed to be. Recruits did not start with real swords and shields. Instead, they were given wooden swords that were twice as heavy as the real thing, and wicker shields that weighed more than the iron-studded ones used in battle. The idea was simple. If you could train with heavier equipment, the real weapons would feel light in your hands. But for the young recruit, it meant arms that burned with pain after every drill. They practiced striking posts set into the ground. Each blow had to be strong, controlled, and precise. They repeated movements again and again, until they could fight without thinking. The instructors shouted commands, sometimes using whips to remind men that laziness was not allowed. A soldier who hesitated was told he would be the one to fall in battle. Drills went far beyond fighting. Soldiers learned how to throw javelins with perfect aim. They practiced building camps quickly, digging trenches, and setting up defenses. They were trained to swim rivers, to cross mountains, and even to cut down trees for building bridges. Every skill that might be needed in a campaign was rehearsed until it became second nature. Running was another constant task. Recruits were ordered to run long distances in full armor. Their sandals pounded the earth, their shields bounced against their arms, their helmets grew hot in the sun. The goal was endurance. A Roman soldier could not simply fight for a few minutes and then rest. He needed the strength to march, to dig, and then to fight at the end of the day. Punishment was always close. If a recruit disobeyed, if he grew lazy, or if he failed to complete his task, the centurions were ready. Punishments could be harsh. Some were beaten. Others were forced to stand guard for extra hours without sleep. The army wanted obedience, not comfort. Yet training was not only about pain. It was also about pride. As the days passed, recruits began to move in step. They learned to trust the man beside them, to raise their shields together, to follow orders without hesitation. Slowly, the group became more than individuals. They became a unit, a legion, a body that could act as one. The Roman army also used mock battles as training. Whole units would clash in formation, practicing their maneuvers. Dust rose into the air, voices shouted commands, wooden swords struck shields. Though the weapons were not sharp, the effort was real. Soldiers learned how to form the testudo, the tortoise formation, where shields locked together above and in front, creating a moving wall. They learned to shift ranks, to hold the line, and to keep order even in the chaos of combat. After such training, real battle almost seemed easier. A soldier who had endured endless marches and heavy wooden weapons found himself ready when the true test came. His body was hardened, his spirit disciplined, and his mind shaped to obey without hesitation. Still, one must remember the cost. For new recruits, training meant exhaustion, blistered feet, sore muscles, and bruised arms. Many likely doubted themselves. Some may have wanted to quit. But those who endured became part of the strongest army of the ancient world. The rhythm of training was constant. Wake at dawn, drill, march, eat plain food, drill again, sleep on hard ground, and wake once more. It was repetition, pain, and persistence. This was how Rome built its legions. Not with gold, not with speeches, but with the sweat and endurance of thousands of men. And when those men were finally shaped into soldiers, they were given another task, one that was less about fighting and more about building. For Rome was not only an army of war, but also an army of engineers. In our next segment, we will see how these soldiers built the very roads that carried Rome across the world. How the Roman army built roads and why they cared. Imagine a narrow track through grass and mud, twisting with the shape of the land. Now picture that same path transformed into a straight line, hard, smooth, and strong, stretching across hills, valleys, and rivers. This is what the Roman army did when it built its famous roads. To this day, many of them still survive, silent proof of Rome's power and patience. The roads of Rome were not only for travel. They were for control. A road allowed soldiers to march quickly, supplies to move safely, and messages to travel faster than before. For the Roman army, roads were as important as swords. A legion without a road was slow and weak. A legion with a road could appear anywhere, at any time. But how did they build them? It was not slaves, as some imagine, but the soldiers themselves who carried much of the work. After all, the Roman soldier was more than a fighter. He was a builder, an engineer, and a laborer. When the order came to lay a road, men picked up shovels, picks, and baskets, and began the long task of shaping the land. First, they cleared the ground of grass, stones, and roots. Then they dug down, creating a trench. Into this trench they layered materials. At the bottom went large stones, heavy and rough, to form a base. On top of this came smaller stones, then gravel, and finally paving stones fitted tightly together. Each layer was pressed down, making the road strong and able to last for centuries. Some roads were crowned slightly in the middle, allowing rain to run off to the sides. Ditches were dug alongside to carry away water. The work was slow, heavy, and endless. Imagine lines of men carrying baskets of stones, dumping them, and returning for more. The sound of hammers striking rock echoed in the air. Dust filled the nose and throat. Yet the result was remarkable. Roman roads stretched for more than 250,000 miles across the empire, with about 50,000 miles paved in stone. From Britain to Syria, from Spain to the Black Sea, the empire was tied together by this web of stone. Travel along the roads was easier than before. Merchants moved their carts, carrying goods like olive oil, wine, and grain. Messengers on horseback rode swiftly, carrying the emperor's orders. Soldiers marched in perfect rhythm, their sandals striking the hard surface. Inns and way stations grew along the routes, offering rest and food for travelers. The roads were not built only for convenience. They were symbols. A Roman road showed that the land belonged to Rome. Wherever the road ran, so did Roman law, Roman power, and Roman presence. To walk along such a road was to feel the empire under your feet. For the soldier, however, building roads was simply another task in the rhythm of army life. Today, he might drill with his sword. Tomorrow, he might carry stones to lay in the trench. The back ached, the hands blistered, but there was no choice. The centurion's orders were final. It is strange to think that the same men who fought battles also built the paths that carried emperors' messages and traders' carts. Yet this was Rome's strength. Its soldiers were not idle between wars. They were always busy, always working, shaping the land in ways that would outlast them. Even now, in parts of Europe and the Middle East, you can walk on stretches of Roman road. The stones are worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, but they remain. Stand on one, and you can imagine the sound of legionnaires marching past, shields on their backs, eyes fixed forward. The road tied them to Rome, and it tied Rome to the world. So roads were more than stones and gravel. They were the empire's lifelines, carrying armies, goods, and ideas. They showed order, discipline, and reach. Without them, Rome might have remained a city on the Tiber. With them, it became an empire. Now, having walked along these ancient roads, let us follow them to their destinations. Many roads led not to cities, but to fortresses. Great stone camps where soldiers lived for years, training, waiting, and sometimes growing bored. In our next segment, we step inside those fortresses to see the barracks, the baths, and the daily routines of Roman soldiers at rest. Roman fortresses, barracks, baths, and boredom. Imagine approaching a Roman fortress. From a distance, it rises like a small city of stone and timber. Tall walls, square towers, and strong gates guard the inside. Around the walls runs a ditch, dug deep to slow enemies. The whole fortress is laid out with military precision. Straight lines, perfect angles, no wasted space. Step inside and the sound changes. Boots strike on stone, voices echo, and smoke drifts from cooking fires. The fortress is alive, yet controlled. It is the home of the Legion, a place where thousands of soldiers live, eat, train, and wait. At the very heart stands the headquarters building. This is the brain of the fortress. Here the commander works, orders are issued, and the standards of the Legion are kept in a sacred room. These standards are not just flags. They are holy objects guarded with honor. To lose one in battle was the greatest shame. Around the headquarters stretch rows of barracks. Each barrack is long and narrow, divided into small rooms. 8 men share one room. Their gear hangs on pegs, Their straw beds line the walls. At the end of the barrack lives the centurion, in a slightly larger room, still simple but marked with authority. Privacy is almost unknown. Every cough, snore, or whisper carries through the thin walls. Life in the barracks is repetitive. Soldiers mend their clothes, polish their armor, and sharpen their swords. They play dice or carve wooden figures to pass the time. They tell stories, complain about officers, or dream of the day they might leave the army with a pension and a small plot of land. But it was not all barracks and boredom. Each fortress had a bathhouse. To the Romans, baths were not luxury, they were necessity. After a day of drilling or building, soldiers visited the baths. They stripped, left their clothes in a cubicle, and moved through rooms of rising heat. Warm water loosened muscles, steam opened pores, and cold pools refreshed the skin. The bath was not only for cleaning. It was for health, for relaxation, and for friendship. In the steam, soldiers joked, gossiped, or even made deals with traders who were allowed inside. The fortress also had workshops where smiths repaired weapons and armor. There were kitchens where bread was baked and stews boiled in great pots. Warehouses stored grain, oil, and wine, carefully measured by officers. Granaries were built off the ground with raised floors to keep out dampness and rats. Everything had its place, and everything was controlled. Yet boredom was always present. Soldiers drilled in the morning, stood guard on the walls, and then had hours with little to do. Some turned to gambling, even though it was officially forbidden. Others carved graffiti on walls, scratched with knives or charcoal. Some spent their wages in taverns just outside the fortress gates, where wine flowed and traders offered goods. Discipline, however, was strict. If a soldier fell asleep on guard duty, punishment could be death. If he disobeyed a command, lashes might follow. Even laziness could be punished. The army valued order above all. Still, the fortress gave security. Behind its walls, a soldier knew he was part of something larger. He was one among thousands, bound by duty, training, and the Eagle Standard. His life might be hard, but it was also certain. Food, shelter, and routine were guaranteed, things not all common folk outside the walls could depend on. And so, the fortress was more than a camp. It was a symbol of Rome's presence, a reminder to local people that the empire was here to stay. When you looked at its walls, you saw not just soldiers but Rome itself, settled in stone. In our next segment, we leave the fortress walls to watch the soldiers at their favorite daily exercise. No, not fighting, but marching. Mile after mile, with heavy packs in perfect order. For the Roman army, the march was as important as the battle. The endless Roman march, why soldiers walked everywhere. If there was one thing a Roman soldier could not escape, it was marching. The Roman army was built on the strength of its legs. Forget horses, forget chariots, most soldiers walked, and they walked far. A typical march could last for hours. 20 miles in a day was normal, and sometimes more. Imagine carrying not only yourself, but a heavy pack on your back. This pack was called the sarcina. Inside it was everything a soldier needed. A cloak, a cooking pot, food rations, tools, and spare sandals. Add to this his armor, shield, sword, and javelins, and you have a load that might weigh more than 30 kilograms. That is like carrying a young child or a sack of stones while marching mile after mile. The Romans even had a nickname for their soldiers. They called them Marius's mules, after the general Gaius Marius who reformed the army centuries earlier. The name was half insult, half compliment. A mule is stubborn, strong, and able to carry heavy loads. So was a legionary. The march was not just about moving from place to place. It was training. The steady rhythm of boots on the ground built endurance. The discipline of keeping the formation, even when tired, built unity. Officers watched closely. A soldier who lagged behind risked shame, punishment, or worse. Every march had order. First came scouts to check the road ahead. Then came the main column of soldiers. Wagons and pack animals followed, carrying extra supplies. Engineers moved with them, ready to repair bridges or build roads. Even doctors and surgeons marched, with their medical kits strapped to donkeys. The end of the march was not rest. As soon as the soldiers stopped, they had to build a camp. This was routine. Dig a ditch, build a rampart with the soil, place wooden stakes to form a wall, and set up tents in neat rows. The camp was like a smaller version of a fortress, temporary but secure. The Romans built these camps so quickly that they became a second nature, like muscle memory. Wherever the legion went, Rome could be rebuilt in a single day. The march tested more than strength. It tested the mind. Imagine walking hour after hour, the sun hot on your helmet, the dust of the road choking your throat, your feet blistering inside sandals. The weight of your pack rubs your shoulders raw. Some soldiers distracted themselves by singing marching songs. Others muttered complaints. A few probably stared at the horizon and wondered why they had ever joined the army in the first place. But for Rome, the march was power. It allowed armies to appear suddenly where enemies did not expect them. It made supply lines steady, since soldiers could move goods quickly across provinces. It also showed Rome's control. Roads stretched like veins across the empire, and on those roads the legions marched, reminding everyone that Roman order was only ever a few days' walk away. Even emperors understood this. Stories tell of Augustus and Hadrian walking with their men, sharing the fatigue to show unity. A good leader knew that marching together kept loyalty strong. For the common soldier, though, the march was simply life. It was sore feet, tired shoulders, and endless roads. You could fight 1 or 2 battles a year, but you could march hundreds of days. Next, we will step into the heart of those battles. Not the glory, not the shining armor, but the gritty reality of what it felt like to stand shield to shield in a Roman formation. Shield to shield, the brutal reality of Roman battle formations. When most people think of the Roman army, they imagine a wall of shields moving forward in perfect order. This image is not far from the truth. Formations were the secret weapon of Rome, and they turned groups of tired, dusty men into an unstoppable machine. The most famous formation was the testudo, or tortoise. Soldiers locked their shields together, the front row holding their straight ahead, the men beside them locking edges, and those in the middle raising shields above their heads. To an enemy, it looked like a giant moving shell of wood and iron. Arrows clattered harmlessly on top, spears glanced off the sides. Slowly, steadily, the tortoise crept forward, until soldiers could break out and fight hand to hand. But the testudo was only one part of a larger system. The main battle line was usually formed of cohorts, each a block of men. They stood shoulder to shoulder, their large rectangular shields overlapping slightly. Behind the shield, each man held his gladius, a short sword designed for stabbing in close quarters. Unlike long swords, which slash, the Roman gladius went straight into the enemy, fast and deadly. Standing in formation was not glamorous. It was terrifying, exhausting, and suffocating. Imagine pressing shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, your shield heavy on your arm, your helmet clanging in your ears. You can smell the sweat of the man next to you, the leather of his armor, the dust rising from the ground. You cannot move freely. Your job is to hold the line, no matter what. The command would come, throw the pilum. These were long javelins with thin iron heads. Soldiers hurled them at the enemy before closing in. The design was clever. When a pilum struck a shield, its soft iron bent, making the shield useless. An enemy either had to drop it or carry it around as dead weight. Once the javelins were thrown, there was no time to think. The clash came quickly. Shields slammed against shields, men shouted, horns blared. Dust filled the air. The front ranks pushed forward, stabbing through gaps, while the men behind pressed them onward. The shield was both defense and weapon. A shove with the shield edge could knock an enemy off balance, making him an easy target. For the soldier in the middle of it all, battle was chaos. You saw almost nothing, except the rim of your shield and the legs of the man in front. You heard screams, metal on metal, and the dull thud of bodies hitting the ground. Fear was always there, gnawing in your stomach, but discipline kept you from breaking ranks. The system worked because no single soldier had to be a hero. Victory depended on the line holding together. If one man fell, another stepped forward. If one rank grew tired, fresh men rotated in from behind. This machine-like order was terrifying to Rome's enemies. Many tribal warriors, used to charging wildly, found themselves crushed against this wall of shields, their courage fading as the line did not break. But the cost was high. Even when victorious, soldiers returned from battle bloody, bruised, and scarred. Armor dented, shields splintered, sandals torn. Many carried wounds that would never heal fully. Some did not return at all. For Rome, though, the system was worth it. Formations turned ordinary farmers and laborers into a force that conquered the known world. Shield by shield, step by step, they built an empire on discipline, not just bravery. In our next segment, we will step away from the battlefield and look at what came after. Because once the fighting ended, there were bodies, prisoners, and the grim task of cleaning up. After the battle, wounds, loot, and the grim cleanup. The noise of battle faded slowly. At first, only the clash of swords and the shouts of men filled the air. Then, as the enemy broke and ran, the field fell into an eerie silence, broken only by groans and cries of the wounded. Victory did not feel glorious. It smelled of blood, sweat, and smoke. For the Roman soldier, the fight did not end when the enemy fled. The battlefield became a place of grim duties. The first was survival. A soldier checked himself for wounds, sometimes only noticing cuts and bruises after the adrenaline faded. A slice on the arm, a deep bruise from a spear blow, or worse, a stab wound. Roman doctors, called medici, moved quickly with their kits. They carried bandages, scalpels, needles, and even strange ointments. Some treatments worked, others were little more than guesses. Surgery without painkillers was common, and soldiers who survived often bore scars for life. The second task was grim, finishing off enemies too wounded to fight back. This was not cruelty, but practicality. A wounded enemy could rise later or slow down the cleanup. Rome preferred order, even on the battlefield. Prisoners, however, were valuable. Captured soldiers could be sold as slaves, traded for ransom, or used to display Rome's power. Then came the gathering of loot. Shields, swords, and armor were stripped from the dead. Some were reused, others melted down for their metal. Gold, coins, and jewelry were taken from bodies. Even clothing and sandals were collected. Nothing went to waste. Soldiers saw loot as part of their pay. Victory meant profit. A good battle could make a man rich, at least for a time. But among the spoils lay the dead. Roman soldiers buried their comrades with respect, often in mass graves near the battlefield. Rituals were performed, prayers whispered, names remembered. For enemies, burial was less certain. Some were left unburied, a warning to others. The battlefield was both sacred ground and a dumping ground, depending on who you were. The cleanup also meant repairing what was broken. Shields were patched, swords sharpened, sandals restrapped. Tents went up once again, fires were lit, and rations handed out. After hours of fighting, the simple act of eating bread and stew felt like heaven. Soldiers joked, sang, or sat in silence, each coping in his own way. But the mind carried wounds as well. Not every soldier slept easily after battle. Nightmares of screaming enemies, the faces of the dying, or the sight of a fallen friend haunted them. Rome did not have a word for trauma, but the men surely felt it. Some drank heavily, others prayed to the gods, hoping for protection before the next fight. Victories were celebrated with processions and speeches, but for the ordinary legionary, triumph was simple: surviving another day. The next march, the next camp, the next battle always lay ahead. Life in the legions did not stop, even after death and destruction. And while soldiers carried the scars, the Roman state carried the glory. Generals wrote reports of brave deeds, emperors posed as mighty conquerors, and the empire's borders expanded. The soldiers' blood fed Rome's pride. Next, we will step away from war for a moment and explore something more human. What soldiers ate, how they cooked, and why food was one of the most important parts of life in camp. Bread, gruel, and wine, the soldiers' diet. Food was the fuel of the Roman army, and feeding thousands of men on the march was no small task. A soldier's stomach, some said, was just as important as his sword. Without regular meals, the great Roman war machine would grind to a halt. So, what did a legionary actually eat? The answer is simple, heavy, and filling food, not feasts. The most important part of the diet was grain, usually wheat. Each soldier carried around 3 days' worth of grain in his pack. When camp was set up, he ground the wheat into flour with a small hand mill, then baked it into flat bread or boiled it into a kind of porridge. Bread and gruel might sound dull, but they provided the energy needed for endless marching and fighting. Alongside grain, soldiers ate beans, lentils, onions, and cabbage when available. Sometimes they added cheese or dried fruit. Meat was rarer, but not absent. Pork, goat, or beef appeared when supplies allowed, often boiled into stews. More often, soldiers ate salted pork, which lasted longer but tasted hard and salty. Fresh meat was usually from animals taken during campaigns, sometimes seized from locals, sometimes carried with the army. One thing never absent was wine. Roman soldiers drank wine daily, but not in the way we think. The wine was usually sour and watered down. Pure wine was considered unhealthy and wasteful. Mixing it with water made it last longer and kept it safer than drinking water alone, which could be contaminated. Soldiers also flavored their wine with herbs, vinegar, or even seawater to make it more palatable. Cooking was done in small groups called contubernia, the tent teams of 8 men. They pooled their rations, set up a fire, and cooked together. This not only saved resources, but also built bonds. Around the fire, men ate, joked, sang, and shared stories. The cooking pot was as much a part of camp life as the shield wall was of battle. Yet food could also be a source of hardship. On long campaigns, supply lines stretched thin. Soldiers might go hungry, relying on foraging or whatever they could seize from locals. Starvation was rare in organized armies, but hunger gnawed at men during difficult marches. The simple diet kept them alive, but it was far from luxurious. Still, compared to many ancient armies, Roman soldiers ate well. Discipline extended to food. Regular meals kept men healthy, strong, and ready to fight. And though bread and gruel might not sound exciting, they were the building blocks of an empire. In the next segment, we will explore the darker side of camp life, punishments, discipline, and the brutal ways Rome kept its legions under control. Whips and warnings, discipline in the legions. The Roman army was not only powerful because of its weapons and tactics. Its true strength came from discipline. Without strict order, tens of thousands of men would become a mob. Rome understood this, and so the legions were governed with rules as harsh as steel. A soldier's life was tightly controlled. Obey orders without question. March when told. Dig when told. Fight when told. Rest only when permitted. This unbending system made the army predictable, reliable, and terrifying to its enemies. But for the soldier, it meant living under constant watch and threat of punishment. The punishments ranged from mild to horrifying. For small offenses like laziness or neglecting equipment, a man might be beaten with sticks, fined, or forced to stand guard for extra hours. Losing your sword or falling asleep on duty was considered serious. Falling asleep could mean death, since one careless man could endanger the entire camp. For graver offenses, the penalties grew crueler. Cowardice, theft from comrades, or desertion often led to execution. Sometimes a soldier was clubbed to death by his fellow soldiers, a grim ritual that reminded everyone that the legion survived only if all obeyed. One of the most feared punishments was decimation. If a unit disobeyed orders or showed cowardice, it could be punished by killing 1 man in 10. The guilty men were chosen by lot, and the survivors carried out the executions themselves. This brutal method ensured fear ran deeper than disobedience. No one wanted to risk being the unlucky 10th. Not all discipline came from terror. Rewards also played a part. Brave deeds could earn extra pay, gifts of gold, or public praise. Generals sometimes gave out crowns or armbands as symbols of valor. Promotions brought honor and authority. Fear controlled the soldier, but ambition inspired him. Discipline extended even to appearance. Soldiers had to keep their armor polished, their shields painted, their hair cut short. Dirty or poorly kept equipment was not only shameful, but also dangerous in battle. A soldier's body, weapons, and tent were expected to be neat and ready at all times. The strict discipline was hated by many, yet it was the backbone of Rome's success. Where other armies broke and scattered, the legions stood firm, even when tired, hungry, or afraid. Rome's iron grip on its soldiers was the reason it conquered such vast lands. But constant discipline also wore men down. The lash, the fear of punishment, and the endless drills left little room for individuality. A soldier belonged not to himself, but to Rome. He was both a man and a machine. In the next segment, we will step into the mind of a legionary and explore how he coped with fear, boredom, and the emotional strain of his hard life. Fear, faith, and superstition, a soldier's inner world. A Roman soldier's armor protected his body, but what protected his mind? Life in the legions was filled with fear, boredom, and uncertainty. One day could be endless marching under the hot sun. Another could bring a sudden battle where death struck without warning. Soldiers needed ways to carry these burdens, and they turned to faith, superstition, and brotherhood. Fear was constant, yet rarely spoken aloud. A soldier might joke around the fire, but before battle, many admitted to trembling hands or dry mouths. To ease this, rituals and symbols were everywhere. Amulets, charms, and small offerings to the gods were common. Some men carried little figurines of Mars, the god of war. Others wore pendants shaped like phalluses, believed to protect them from evil spirits and bad luck. Religion played a powerful role. Before battles, sacrifices were made, and priests looked for omens in the livers of animals or in the flight of birds. If the signs were good, soldiers felt braver. If they were bad, anxiety spread like wildfire. Commanders often ignored unfavorable omens, but the rank and file whispered about them in the dark. Faith provided a sense of order in a chaotic world. Superstition also ruled daily life. Dropping your sword before battle was considered unlucky. Tripping as you left camp could be taken as a bad omen. Even the way a raven croaked might be interpreted as a sign of victory or disaster. The Roman soldier lived in a world where every little accident seemed charged with meaning. Yet fear was not only about death. Boredom and isolation gnawed at men. Campaigns meant long stretches of waiting, digging, and marching with little excitement. To cope, soldiers told stories, sang songs, and teased each other. Humor was a shield against despair. Nicknames and inside jokes strengthened bonds. Comradeship was perhaps the strongest support of all. A legionary did not fight only for Rome, but also for the man beside him in the line. Tentmates became closer than family, sharing food, secrets, and burdens. In battle, abandoning your comrades was unthinkable. Shame was worse than death. So, though Rome ruled its soldiers with harsh discipline, the men survived through faith, superstition, and the deep comfort of brotherhood. The inner world of the soldier was a mix of fear and courage, laughter and dread, hope and resignation. In the next segment, we will step away from the battlefield and look at how soldiers spent their precious free time. Gambling, writing letters, and finding moments of simple joy. Dice, letters, and leisure, free time in the legions. Even the harshest army cannot march forever. Between drills, guard duty, and construction work, Roman soldiers found pockets of free time. These hours were short and often filled with noise and laughter. Leisure was a chance to escape the weight of discipline, if only for a little while. One favorite pastime was gambling. Dice were small, easy to carry, and addictive. Soldiers threw them on the ground or on wooden boards, shouting and arguing as the cubes tumbled. Gambling was officially forbidden in the army, but commanders usually turned a blind eye unless fights broke out. Wages disappeared quickly at the gaming table. Some men became rich in luck, others sank into debt. Drinking was another escape. Wine was watered down during meals, but in taverns near forts or camps, soldiers often sought stronger drinks. Too much drinking led to trouble, but it was hard to resist after long marches or battles. Songs, jokes, and brawls filled these moments, as men tried to forget their hardships. Writing letters was a calmer pursuit. Wax tablets and styluses allowed soldiers to send words home, though papyrus was used too when available. Surviving letters show touching details. Men asking their families for warm socks, reminding wives to manage farms, or begging for news of children. Literacy was not universal, but the army encouraged it, since reading orders and keeping records were vital skills. Some leisure activities were physical. Wrestling, running, or spear-throwing contests kept men fit and entertained. Mock battles were common, sometimes fought with wooden swords for fun. These games built both skill and spirit, blending play with training. Music also played a role. Soldiers sang during marches, keeping rhythm and lifting spirits. Around the fire, tunes mixed with laughter and stories of past battles. Camp musicians with horns and flutes added to the atmosphere, though their main duty was sounding commands. And then there were friendships and romances. Soldiers often formed close ties with local people near forts. Roman law forbade official marriage during service, but this rule was often ignored. Many soldiers had partners and children in secret, forming families that lived just outside the camp. These bonds made army life bearable, though they also created heartbreak when orders forced men to march away. Leisure was fragile, but it mattered. Dice, songs, letters, and stolen moments of love gave Roman soldiers a glimpse of humanity in an otherwise grinding life. In the next segment, we will turn to the physical environment itself. The forts and camps where soldiers spent so much of their time. These structures were more than shelters. They were small cities of order and routine. Life behind the walls, inside a Roman fort. A Roman fort was not just a camp. It was a carefully designed machine of order, discipline, and control. Step inside the wooden or stone gates, and you entered a world built to keep thousands of men fed, housed, and ready for war. The layout was always planned with precision. Roads crossed in straight lines, forming a grid. At the center stood the headquarters building, the Principia. Here the commanding officers worked, records were kept, and the standards of the legion were guarded. These standards, tall poles topped with symbols of the unit, were sacred. Losing one in battle was the deepest disgrace. Nearby was the Praetorium, the house of the commanding officer. Compared to the soldiers' quarters, it was almost luxurious, with private rooms, kitchens, and even gardens. Around this core were granaries filled with supplies, workshops for repairs, and storehouses for weapons. The army valued efficiency, so every space had its purpose. The soldiers lived in barracks. Each long building was divided into small rooms. 8 men, known as a contubernium, shared a single chamber. These rooms were cramped, dark, and smelled of sweat, oil, and damp clothes. Privacy was non-existent. At the front of each barracks was a slightly larger room for the centurion, who lived better than his men, but still close enough to watch over them. Bathhouses were another key feature. Even far from Rome, the army insisted on cleanliness. A Roman fort might have hot baths, steam rooms, and cold plunges. These were not only for hygiene, but also for relaxation, gossip, and sometimes minor medical treatments. Forts also included bakeries, stables, and sometimes even taverns within or just outside the walls. Local traders often gathered near forts, selling food, wine, or other goods. Families of soldiers, though not officially allowed inside, often lived in nearby villages that grew into permanent settlements. The walls themselves were more than defense. Guard towers looked out over the landscape, and gates controlled movement in and out. Soldiers rotated shifts, patrolling and keeping watch. This constant vigilance reminded everyone that danger could arrive at any time. Life inside the fort followed a rhythm. Horns signaled the start of drills, meals, or guard duty. Daily inspections kept order. Punishments were public, reminding all of the cost of failure. Yet within these strict walls, bonds of friendship grew, meals were shared, and routines gave soldiers a sense of stability. In short, a fort was both prison and protection. It limited freedom, yet offered safety and structure. For many men, it became the closest thing to home during their long years of service. In the next segment, we will march beyond the fort walls and see what happened when soldiers met the local people of conquered lands. This relationship was full of trade, tension, and sometimes love. Friends or foes, soldiers and local populations. Wherever Roman soldiers built forts, they changed the world around them. Local villagers and tribes suddenly found themselves living beside thousands of armed men. This relationship could be tense, yet it was also deeply connected, mixing trade, culture, and personal bonds. At first, locals often feared the soldiers. Armies marched in with banners, horns, and discipline, reminding everyone of Rome's power. Taxes and tribute followed, and some villages lost land to the construction of forts and roads. The presence of a large garrison could feel like a constant shadow, reminding people that Rome was now in charge. But human needs quickly softened these boundaries. Soldiers required food, clothes, leather, tools, and countless supplies. Local craftsmen and farmers provided them, earning money and access to Roman goods in return. Markets grew near forts, where traders sold bread, wine, olives, and local specialties. Over time, whole communities sprang up around these camps. Cultural exchange followed trade. Roman soldiers came from every corner of the empire, bringing languages, religions, and customs with them. A soldier from Syria might share Eastern spices, while another from Spain brought stories of Iberian horses. Locals adopted Roman coins, weights, and even clothing styles. In return, soldiers learned local languages and joined festivals or ceremonies. Romance was another form of exchange. Officially, soldiers were not allowed to marry during service, but this rule was often ignored. Many formed long-term partnerships with local women. Children were born, and though not always recognized by Roman law, they lived in the settlements outside forts. Archaeologists have found evidence of these families in the form of children's shoes, toys, and small graves near military sites. Yet, tensions always remained. Soldiers could be arrogant, and some abused their power. Taxes collected with military backing created resentment. Drunken brawls between locals and soldiers were common. Rebellions sometimes began in these very frontier zones, sparked by anger at Roman presence. Still, in many regions, the army became a bridge between worlds. Frontier towns blended Roman and local architecture. Temples worshipped both Roman gods and native deities side by side. Over time, many conquered people joined the army themselves, wearing Roman armor, while still carrying their local traditions in memory. The bond between soldiers and locals was complex, neither purely hostile nor entirely peaceful. It was a mixture of power, survival, and human connection. In the next segment, we will shift focus back to the soldiers' minds, exploring how they felt about service, loyalty, and the idea of Rome itself. What did it mean to give your life to an empire that might never know your name? Loyalty and identity, fighting for Rome. For a Roman soldier, loyalty was more than just obedience, it was the foundation of survival. A legion relied on unity. If even one man broke discipline in battle, the whole line could collapse. But what exactly did loyalty mean in the Roman world? And how did men build an identity around serving an empire so vast that most never even saw Rome itself? First, loyalty was directed to the legion. Each legion had its number, its eagle standard, and its proud traditions. Soldiers swore an oath, called the sacramentum, binding them to obey commands without question. To betray that oath was not only treason, it was sacrilege, an offense against the gods. Next came loyalty to fellow soldiers. A man's contubernium, the group of 8 men who shared a room, became like a second family. They marched together, ate together, dug ditches together, and fought side by side. Trust was forged in daily hardship. A soldier knew his life depended on the shield of the man next to him. There was also loyalty to commanders. A charismatic general could inspire fierce devotion. Some soldiers followed their leaders not just out of duty, but out of admiration. Julius Caesar, for example, was so beloved by his men that they would march through mud, snow, and famine simply because he asked it. A great leader could make soldiers feel they were part of something greater. But there was always a tension between loyalty to Rome itself and loyalty to individual commanders. Rome was an idea, distant and abstract for many recruits. They might never set foot in the city, yet they were asked to shed blood in its name. For some, this was honorable service. For others, it felt like blind sacrifice. Over time, soldiers began identifying not only as members of their tribe or village, but as Romans. The army was one of the strongest tools of Romanization. Men who served together shared Latin phrases, Roman rituals, and even burial practices. When they retired, they brought this identity back home, spreading Roman ways across the provinces. Still, loyalty was tested constantly. Campaigns dragged on for years. Pay was sometimes delayed. Generals might demand suicidal bravery. In moments like these, soldiers grumbled, cursed, and even mutinied. Yet mutiny was rare, because the punishments were so brutal and the bond of comradeship so strong. So, what did it mean to fight for Rome? For many soldiers, it meant loyalty to their brothers in arms first, then to their general, and only last to the distant Senate and people of Rome. The empire relied on this layered loyalty to survive, even if it meant that sometimes generals used their men to seize power for themselves. In the next segment, we will step into the heart of battle itself. What was it like to fight in a Roman formation, shield to shield, with the ground trembling under your feet? The reality of battle, blood, noise, and fear. When we imagine Roman soldiers in battle, we often picture neat rows of men marching forward in perfect silence, shields locked like a wall. That image is true in part, but it leaves out the chaos, fear, and sheer noise of ancient warfare. To understand what battle felt like, we must step into the ranks and hear it through a soldier's ears. The first thing a man noticed was the sound. Thousands of soldiers moving together made a low rumble, like thunder rolling across the earth. Shields banged against spears, armor clattered, horns and trumpets blared commands. On the other side, enemy warriors shouted war cries, beating drums or blowing horns of their own. A soldier's heart would pound in rhythm with the noise, fear mixing with adrenaline. Then came the sight of the enemy. Sometimes it was another organized army, with banners flying and troops lined in formation. Other times it was a wild rush of tribesmen with painted bodies and flashing weapons. Either way, the human mind struggled to take in the scale. Thousands of eyes staring back at you, thousands of weapons ready to cut you down. When the clash began, the neatness of formation turned into chaos. Soldiers hurled pila, the heavy-throwing spears designed to bend on impact so enemies could not throw them back. The air filled with whistles and thuds as spears struck shields, armor, or flesh. Many men fell before swords were even drawn. Then came hand-to-hand combat. The Roman sword, short and sharp, was meant for stabbing, not slashing. Soldiers pressed forward behind their shields, stabbing into gaps, aiming for the stomach or groin. The shield itself became a weapon, used to shove enemies backward or smash their faces. The senses were overwhelmed. The stink of blood, sweat, and mud filled the air. The screams of the wounded mixed with the roar of the living. The ground grew slippery, and sometimes men stumbled on corpses. Fear sat heavy in the stomach, but training pushed soldiers to keep moving, to follow the rhythm of drill even when terror clawed at the mind. Battles could last hours. Fatigue became as dangerous as enemy blades. Soldiers who survived often recalled their arms shaking with exhaustion, their mouths dry, their vision blurred. Victory was not always clear in the middle of the fight. Only when the enemy broke and fled did soldiers realize they were still standing. After the clash, silence felt strange. Survivors looked around, counting who remained and who was gone. The field was covered with bodies, some groaning for help, others still. Soldiers rarely forgot the sights of battle. Many carried those memories for life. For the Roman army, discipline was the key to surviving the madness. Training drilled men to hold their formation, to trust their comrades, and to keep fighting even when fear threatened to break them. That discipline was why Rome won so many wars, even against enemies who outnumbered them. In the next segment, we will step back from the clash of swords to see what happened after a battle ended. How did soldiers treat the fallen, the wounded, and the prisoners left behind? Aftermath, the fallen and the wounded. The battle might end with a trumpet blast or with the enemy breaking and fleeing, but for Roman soldiers, the hardest part often came afterward. The aftermath of battle was not glorious, it was grim, messy, and unforgettable. First came the sounds of silence mixed with groans. Where moments before the air had been filled with the roar of combat, now there were only the cries of the wounded, begging for water or calling for comrades who would never answer. A soldier who survived stood among bodies scattered like broken dolls, many covered in blood, armor bent or shattered. The wounded were the first concern. Roman soldiers tried to carry injured comrades back to camp when possible. Each legion had medical staff, including medici doctors, who treated cuts, broken bones, and even attempted surgery. Wounds were washed with vinegar, bandaged with cloth, and sometimes stitched. Amputations were not uncommon if a limb was too damaged to save. Pain relief was minimal. A soldier might be given herbs, wine, or simply held down while a wound was cauterized with a hot iron. For those too badly hurt, death was often quicker than Roman medicine. Still, comradeship meant men tried to save each other. Soldiers were more likely to risk themselves pulling a friend to safety than a stranger, showing again how much the contubernium bond mattered. Then came the task of dealing with the dead. Romans buried their own fallen whenever possible. If time allowed, graves were dug, often shallow, and soldiers laid their comrades to rest with care. Weapons or small personal items might be buried alongside them. For officers, funerals were more elaborate, sometimes including cremation and ceremonies that honored their rank. Enemy dead were not treated with the same respect. Often, they were stripped of armor and weapons, which were collected as spoils of war. In some cases, bodies were left unburied as a warning to others. This harsh treatment reinforced Roman dominance, but also revealed the brutality of war. Prisoners were another matter. Captured enemies could be enslaved, ransomed, or sometimes executed. Strong young men and women often ended up as slaves, marched away in chains to be sold. Leaders of rebellions or enemy chiefs might face public humiliation or death as an example. For Roman soldiers, this was simply another part of war, but for the conquered it meant the destruction of families and communities. The aftermath also included spoils. Victorious soldiers looted enemy camps, taking food, valuables, and weapons. These spoils were often divided among the men, though commanders took the largest share. Loot could make a campaign profitable, but it also created tension if soldiers felt cheated out of their fair reward. Finally, the survivors reflected. Relief mixed with grief. Some rejoiced in being alive, others mourned silently. Many carried guilt for leaving comrades behind. Battle left scars not just on bodies, but on minds. Though Romans did not have words like trauma or shock, their writings suggest that memories of war haunted men long after the fighting ended. In the next segment, we will move from the battlefield to daily life again. What was it like for soldiers between campaigns, when they were not fighting but still living under the strict order of the legionary camp? Life between battles, the routine of the camp. Not every day in the life of a Roman soldier was filled with blood and fighting. In fact, most days were spent in the camp, where discipline and routine kept the army sharp even when there was no enemy in sight. Life between battles was not restful, it was structured, strict, and sometimes painfully boring. When soldiers were not marching, they lived in military camps known as castra. These were more like small towns than temporary shelters. The camp was carefully planned, built in a grid with straight roads, a central headquarters, storage areas, and rows of tents or huts for the men. High earth walls, ditches, and wooden palisades made the camp into a fortress. Each time the army stopped to rest, soldiers built this defensive camp from scratch. Digging ditches, cutting wood, and setting walls became second nature. Daily routine began early. A trumpet woke the men before sunrise. They washed if water was available, ate a simple breakfast of bread or porridge, and then gathered for orders. The day's duties could vary. Soldiers trained, drilled, and marched even without an enemy nearby. Discipline demanded constant practice. The idea was simple. If the body and mind were trained to follow commands automatically, then in real battle they would act without hesitation. Training often meant hours of marching in full armor, sword drills, shield practice, or building mock fortifications. Soldiers also practiced throwing their pila, heavy spears, and sparring with wooden swords heavier than real ones. Sweat and exhaustion were constant companions, even in peacetime. But the Legion was not just an army, it was also a workforce. Soldiers built roads, bridges, aqueducts, and forts across the empire. They cleared forests, dug canals, and even worked in quarries. Some complained that this felt more like slavery than soldiering, but it was part of Roman strategy. These construction projects made travel easier, strengthened Roman control, and kept idle men busy. An idle soldier was a dangerous soldier, so commanders filled every hour with purpose. Camp life also included guard duty. Soldiers took turns standing watch at the gates and along the walls day and night. Slacking on guard duty was a serious offense. In fact, being caught asleep on watch could mean death, since one careless man could put the entire camp in danger. When duties were lighter, soldiers had some personal time. They mended clothing, sharpened weapons, wrote letters if they could, or gambled with dice and knucklebones. Some sang songs, told stories, or carved little figures from wood. A few kept pets like dogs to brighten the hard life of the camp. Even so, boredom was often worse than danger. Many men longed for the excitement of battle simply to break the monotony. Food was another constant concern. The army provided grain, which soldiers ground into flour and baked into flatbread. Meat was not common unless animals were captured or purchased. Soldiers also ate cheese, olives, beans, and whatever they could forage. Wine mixed with water was the normal drink, though sometimes sour and unpleasant. A soldier who ate well was a soldier who fought well, so supply lines were guarded as fiercely as battlefronts. Discipline in the camp was always strict. Punishments were harsh, ranging from fines and extra duties to flogging or even execution. The Romans believed that fear of punishment kept the army strong. A man who stole from his comrades or disobeyed orders could expect no mercy. Yet for all its hardships, camp life built community. The tent groups and sentries became like families. Shared suffering, shared meals, and shared danger created bonds that lasted long after a campaign ended. In the next segment, we will explore something less grim: how soldiers entertained themselves, what games they played, and how they found moments of joy in a life of discipline and danger. Leisure, games, and soldier humor. Even in the strict world of the Roman army, men needed moments of rest and laughter. Life between battles was long, and boredom could wear down even the strongest fighter. To survive mentally as well as physically, soldiers turned to games, entertainment, and humor. These simple distractions gave them relief from the harsh routine of camp. One of the most common pastimes was gambling. Soldiers used dice carved from bone, ivory, or bronze, and they played with coins or small tokens. Games of chance were fast, noisy, and often heated. Roman laws technically banned gambling outside of festivals, but soldiers were rarely stopped. Wagers ranged from food rations to clothing, and sometimes even personal equipment. Losing your cloak or boots could make life miserable, yet the thrill of risking everything kept men playing. Another popular game was tabula, a kind of board game that resembled backgammon. Soldiers scratched boards into the ground or carried wooden ones. Counters moved according to dice rolls and strategy mixed with luck. Knucklebones, similar to jacks, were also played. These small games could fill long hours and gave men a chance to forget their duties for a while. Not all entertainment was quiet. Soldiers often held contests of strength or skill. Wrestling, spear throwing, and foot races were common. Mock battles with wooden swords gave men both training and amusement. The stronger or faster soldiers gained respect, and competitions built pride within the unit. Music also played a role. Soldiers sang marching songs or humorous verses in camp. Some carried small instruments like flutes or lyres. Singing lifted spirits, especially after long days of labor. Roman humor was often crude, filled with jokes about bodily functions, women, or officers. These jokes, though rough, helped men bond through shared laughter. Storytelling was another pastime. Around campfires, veterans told tales of past campaigns, sometimes exaggerated into legends. Younger recruits listened wide-eyed, imagining future glory. These stories carried lessons too, warnings about mistakes, advice on surviving combat, and reminders of what it meant to be Roman. Some soldiers also carved or crafted during spare time. Small figures, decorated knife handles, or engraved dice show that men used creativity to pass the hours. Others scratched graffiti on walls, leaving behind names, insults, or funny drawings. Archaeologists have found rude sketches on Roman barracks walls that prove soldiers had the same sense of humor as people today. Of course, not all leisure was wholesome. Drinking could be a problem. Wine was standard, but soldiers sometimes drank too much, leading to fights. Commanders tried to control this with discipline, but in faraway camps, drunken brawls were common. Brothels also followed armies, and many soldiers spent pay there, though this often brought trouble and disease. Despite the strict life, laughter was essential. Joking about hardships, mocking officers, or playing games gave men relief. Humor became a weapon against fear, boredom, and homesickness. Without it, the heavy weight of discipline and danger might have broken the spirit of even the toughest legionary. In the next segment, we will shift from soldiers at play to the officers who commanded them. What was life like for the centurions, the men who stood between generals and ordinary soldiers? The centurion, backbone of the Roman army. When most people picture a Roman soldier, they imagine the legionary in his armor and red cloak. But the true backbone of the Roman army was not the ordinary soldier, it was the centurion. These men were the middle layer of command, the ones who turned orders from generals into action on the battlefield. Without centurions, the Roman army would have collapsed under its own weight. A centurion was responsible for about 80 men, known as a century. He trained them, disciplined them, and led them in battle. His voice and presence held the group together. If the line wavered, it was the centurion who stepped forward, shouting orders, keeping shields locked, and urging men not to break. Unlike most officers in other ancient armies, Roman centurions fought on the front line. They did not stand behind the men giving orders from safety. They stood shoulder to shoulder with their soldiers. Their armor often included a helmet with a side-to-side crest, making them easy to spot in the chaos of battle. This visibility was both inspiring and dangerous. Enemies often targeted centurions first, knowing that killing one could weaken the unit's morale. Becoming a centurion was not easy. Some earned the position through years of loyal service, proving themselves in combat again and again. Others were promoted for bravery or leadership. The role demanded toughness, intelligence, and the ability to control men under extreme pressure. Centurions were feared by their soldiers, but also respected, since they shared every hardship and risk. Discipline was their most important duty. A centurion enforced strict rules with punishments that could be brutal. Soldiers who disobeyed faced flogging, extra labor, or worse. Yet centurions were not mindless bullies. They had to balance fear with loyalty. A unit that hated its leader too much could collapse, but one that both feared and respected him would fight like iron. Centurions were paid more than ordinary soldiers, sometimes double or even more depending on rank. They lived slightly better, with larger tents and better equipment, but they were still close to their men compared to high-ranking officers. They shared the marches, the camp labor, and often the same dangers. In Roman society, centurions gained status. They were seen as symbols of Roman discipline and strength. Inscriptions show that many retired centurions went on to become local officials or landowners. The position was a ladder of social mobility, something rare in the rigid Roman world. But the life of a centurion was harsh. Because they always stood in the thick of fighting, they suffered heavy casualties. Ancient writers mention battles where nearly all the centurions of a legion were killed, proving just how dangerous the role was. A centurion's courage was never in doubt, but his lifespan was often shorter than the men he commanded. Even so, the centurion was admired across the empire. He represented Roman order, discipline, and leadership. Generals might plan strategies, but it was the centurion who made sure ordinary soldiers carried them out. In the next segment, we will climb even higher up the ladder of command and look at the life of generals and how they lived compared to the men under them. Generals and the burden of command. At the very top of the Roman military hierarchy stood the generals. These men carried the weight of entire campaigns on their shoulders. They decided where armies marched, when battles were fought, and how supplies were managed. While soldiers carried swords and centurions carried discipline, generals carried responsibility. Victory or defeat, life or death for thousands, rested on their judgment. A Roman general was usually a man of high social rank, often from the senatorial class. Some were experienced soldiers who rose through the ranks, but many were appointed because of political connections. In the Republic, generals were often elected officials such as consuls or praetors, while in the Empire, the emperor himself chose commanders. This meant that a general might be a brilliant strategist or a man with little military sense who gained power through family influence. Life for a general in the field was very different from that of an ordinary soldier. While soldiers squeezed into tents of 8, a general often had a large tent or even a specially built headquarters. He traveled with servants, scribes, and sometimes even philosophers or entertainers. Meals were richer, clothes finer, and living space far more comfortable. To the men, their general seemed almost like a king inside the camp. But comfort did not erase the crushing stress. A general had to make decisions with limited information. Scouts could bring reports, but weather, terrain, and enemy trickery made everything uncertain. If a general chose wrongly, thousands of his soldiers might die. And in Rome, failure was rarely forgiven. A defeated general could be put on trial, stripped of wealth, or even executed. In the Republic, defeat could mean political ruin. Under emperors, it could mean death at the emperor's command. Generals also had to manage politics as much as war. They wrote letters to the Senate or emperor, negotiated with allies, and sometimes had to keep rival officers in line. Ambition burned in many of them, since military success could lead to enormous fame. A victorious general might be awarded a triumph, a grand parade in Rome where he displayed captured treasures and prisoners. Such glory could make a man one of the most powerful figures in the empire. Some generals built deep loyalty among their men. Julius Caesar, for example, was adored by his soldiers because he shared their hardships. He ate simple rations, marched on foot, and spoke with ordinary legionaries. Other generals stayed distant, keeping themselves apart in luxury, which could breed resentment. The burden of command meant that generals rarely enjoyed peaceful lives. They were under constant pressure to win, often moving from one campaign to another. Victories brought glory, but defeats brought shame. The stakes were always high, and unlike soldiers who could share laughter and games in camp, generals often stood alone with their choices. In the next segment, we will step away from the battlefield and look at the logistics behind the Roman war machine. After all, an army could not survive on bravery alone. It needed food, supplies, and organization. Feeding the legion, supply, and logistics. A Roman army could win or lose not just on the battlefield, but in its stomach. The saying, "an army marches on its stomach," is true for every age, but the Romans turned supply into a science. Without bread, grain, meat, and water, even the toughest legionary could not fight. The most important food for a soldier was grain, usually wheat. Each soldier received a regular ration and had to grind it himself into flour. From this, he baked bread or a kind of porridge called pulse. Bread was filling, cheap, and easy to store, making it the backbone of the army diet. Meat, cheese, and wine were also provided when available, but grain was always the core. Moving this grain was no easy task. A legion of 5,000 men needed tons of food every month, not to mention food for animals like horses and mules. Supplies were carried in wagons, on pack animals, or even on the backs of soldiers. Roman supply officers had to plan carefully, since an army far from home could not simply buy food from shops. Sometimes the army bought food from local markets, but often it seized supplies from the land it marched through. This was risky, since relying on local food could starve the army if the countryside was empty or hostile. For this reason, Roman generals built supply chains, with wagons, ships, and depots stretching back to friendly territory. Water was just as vital. Soldiers needed clean sources of drinking water, especially in hot climates. Camps were always placed near rivers or springs, and engineers sometimes dug wells. In desert campaigns, water shortages could be deadly. Records show entire armies collapsing from thirst rather than enemy attacks. Roman engineers also built roads that made supply easier. Grain wagons could move faster on paved roads than through muddy fields. The famous Roman roads were not just for civilians. They were designed to keep armies moving and supplied. Another part of logistics was animals. Horses pulled wagons, mules carried loads, and oxen provided muscle for heavy carts. These animals also needed food, which meant even more grain and fodder. In some campaigns, more food went to the animals than to the men. For special campaigns, the Romans even built supply ships to carry grain along rivers or across the sea. During wars in distant provinces, fleets of ships acted as floating food stores. Keeping these ships safe from storms and pirates was another task that required careful planning. Despite all this organization, shortages still happened. Soldiers sometimes went hungry or survived on half rations. Hungry men were restless and weak, so keeping the army fed was as important as training or weapons. A well-fed soldier could march long distances and fight with strength, but a starving one was already defeated before battle began. The Roman ability to feed and supply huge armies was one of the secrets of their success. Other ancient armies often collapsed when food ran out, but Rome's careful planning gave them an edge that lasted for centuries. In the next segment, we will explore how Rome moved not just food but also knowledge and communication across its vast empire, keeping armies connected even when they were hundreds of miles from the capital. Messages across the empire, communication in war. The Roman Empire stretched across 3 continents, from the deserts of Africa to the forests of Britain. Armies marched far from Rome, and yet orders still had to travel from the capital to distant generals, and reports had to return from the frontier. In a world without telephones or radios, this was no small task. The simplest way to send a message was by messenger on horseback. A rider could travel far faster than a marching soldier, covering dozens of miles in a single day. The Romans created a system of relay stations, called the cursus publicus. Along the great Roman roads, fresh horses and riders waited. A message could be handed from one rider to another, allowing it to speed across the empire in record time. This system was so efficient that an order from the emperor in Rome could reach Gaul or Spain within days, and even distant provinces like Syria within a few weeks. For the ancient world, this was lightning fast. In the army itself, communication was just as important. On the battlefield, generals needed to signal their men quickly. Since shouting could not be heard over the clash of weapons, the Romans used horns, trumpets, and flags. A blast on a horn might mean advance, retreat, or form a defensive line. Standard bearers carried tall flags topped with eagles or symbols, and soldiers learned to follow their movements. At night, fire and torches were used to signal. In coastal areas, bonfires or smoke could send warnings of enemy fleets. Some historians believe the Romans may have even used coded torch signals to send short messages across long distances. Written reports were another tool. Generals wrote letters to the Senate or emperor, describing victories, defeats, and requests for more supplies. These letters were carefully carried by trusted couriers, since losing them to the enemy could reveal valuable secrets. Sometimes generals carved brief reports onto tablets or even bronze plaques to ensure they lasted. But communication was not always perfect. Messages could be delayed by bad weather, broken roads, or enemy attacks. A general might wait weeks for instructions, only to find the situation had already changed by the time orders arrived. This forced many commanders to act on their own judgment, balancing obedience with necessity. The Roman system of communication shows how advanced they were compared to other ancient powers. While enemies struggled with slow word-of-mouth messengers, the Romans built a network of roads, stations, and signals that tied their empire together. This ability to send orders and reports across vast distances helped them control not just an army, but an entire world. In the next segment, we will look at the role of Roman engineers, who not only built these roads and stations, but also constructed bridges, fortifications, and siege engines that turned the tide of war. Roman engineers, builders of war. If you imagine an army, you may first think of soldiers with swords and shields, but one of Rome's greatest strengths came from its engineers. These men were the builders of war. They designed and constructed the roads, bridges, forts, and machines that allowed the legions to fight and win. Without them, the Roman army would have been far less powerful. The most famous work of Roman engineers was their roads. These were not simple dirt paths, but carefully layered stone highways that stretched across the empire. Built straight and strong, they let armies move quickly and supplies follow behind. Roads were so well made that some still exist today, nearly 2,000 years later. Another skill of Roman engineers was bridge building. When armies came to a river, engineers did not wait helplessly, they built a crossing. Using wood, ropes, and iron nails, they could construct sturdy bridges in a matter of days. Julius Caesar once shocked his enemies by building a wooden bridge across the Rhine River in just 10 days, allowing his army to march into German territory. Engineers also built fortifications. Every night when the army camped, they dug ditches, raised walls, and put up wooden defenses. This made even a temporary camp into a small fortress, protecting soldiers while they rested. Over time, many of these camps became permanent forts, turning into the seeds of future towns. In battle, engineers operated siege engines. These were great machines like battering rams, towers, and catapults. A battering ram could smash through gates, while siege towers, tall wooden structures on wheels, allowed soldiers to climb over enemy walls. Catapults and ballistae hurled stones, darts, or flaming missiles to break defenses or terrify enemies. The work of engineers required skill in math, design, and practical problem-solving. They had to know how to cut stone, bend wood, shape metal, and use ropes and pulleys. They were also skilled in water control, digging canals, building aqueducts, and draining marshes so that armies could move where enemies thought it was impossible. Their contribution was not glamorous, but it was vital. A legion with engineers could march further, cross obstacles, and attack strongholds that other armies would have avoided. Enemies often found themselves shocked not just by Roman bravery, but by Roman construction. The reputation of Roman engineers was so strong that even centuries after the empire fell, later armies copied their methods. Castles, catapults, and even modern military engineering all trace roots back to the Roman legions. In the next segment, we will explore another special role in the army, one that carried not stone and wood but life itself, the medics and doctors of the legions. Roman medics, healing on the battlefield. War brings wounds, and without care an army cannot fight for long. The Roman legions understood this, which is why they developed one of the most advanced systems of military medicine in the ancient world. Roman medics were not just bandage carriers, they were trained professionals, skilled in surgery and treatment. Every large Roman camp had a valetudinarium, which was a kind of military hospital. These were carefully designed with long corridors, small rooms for patients, good ventilation, and drainage for clean water. Soldiers who were hurt in battle or fell sick during campaigns were brought here for care. This was unusual for the ancient world, since most armies simply left wounded men behind. The medics, called medici, had knowledge of herbs, surgical tools, and cleaning methods. They carried small kits filled with scalpels, tweezers, bandages, and probes. Archaeologists have found many Roman medical instruments made of bronze and iron, some of which look surprisingly similar to tools used by doctors today. When a soldier was wounded, medics cleaned the injury with wine or vinegar, both of which killed germs to some extent. They stitched deep cuts with thread, set broken bones with wooden splints, and used bandages soaked in honey, which has natural healing properties. For pain, they sometimes gave opium or crushed herbs. On the battlefield itself, there were first aid tents. Here, medics rushed to treat men quickly, stopping bleeding and carrying the most serious cases back to the hospital. Each legion had men trained as stretcher bearers, ready to move the wounded even while arrows and javelins fell. One of Rome's most impressive achievements was how it valued the health of its soldiers. The army invested in doctors not only to save lives, but to keep men fit to fight. A soldier who recovered could return to the ranks, which meant the legion remained strong. This practical approach gave Rome an edge over enemies who often lost countless men to untreated wounds or disease. Of course, Roman medicine was not perfect. Soldiers still died from infections, fever, and injuries that modern medicine could easily cure. But compared to their rivals, the Romans were far ahead. Their hospitals and treatments set a model for later European medicine, and their knowledge passed down through centuries. The presence of medics also gave soldiers confidence. Knowing that someone would try to save them if they fell helped morale. An army that cared for its men was an army that could keep fighting. In the next segment, we will turn from the healers back to the leaders, exploring how Roman generals and commanders made decisions that shaped battles and history. Generals and commanders, brains of the legion. Behind every legion stood not only soldiers, but the sharp minds of its leaders. A Roman army did not move without orders, and at the top of the chain stood the generals and commanders who decided where and when to strike. Their choices shaped the fate of battles, cities, and sometimes entire empires. The highest authority in the field was the general, often a consul, proconsul, or an emperor himself. A general had supreme power over strategy. He chose where to march, where to camp, and how to engage the enemy. His authority was so great that the lives of tens of thousands of men depended on his judgment. Below the general were the legates. These men commanded legions on behalf of the general. They were usually senators or nobles, appointed by Rome, and they held both military and political responsibility. A legate had to be loyal and skilled, since any mistake could lose an entire legion. The tribunes came next. Each legion had 6 tribunes, young officers often from wealthy families. They were learning leadership, and while not as powerful as legates, they helped manage discipline, training, and the flow of orders. For many, serving as a tribune was a first step in a political career back in Rome. Yet the real backbone of command rested with the centurions. Each century, about 80 men, had one centurion leading them. These officers were often promoted from the ranks, chosen for bravery, discipline, and leadership. They wore distinctive armor with crests on their helmets, so soldiers could spot them in battle. A legion had dozens of centurions, and together they kept the vast army running smoothly. Communication was vital. Orders had to reach every man, even in the noise of battle. This was done through signals, trumpets, banners, and runners. A general might send a message to a legate, who passed it to centurions, who shouted it to the soldiers. Discipline ensured that even in chaos, commands were followed. Famous generals like Julius Caesar, Scipio Africanus, and Trajan became legends because of their ability to think ahead, adapt, and inspire their troops. Caesar, for example, often marched his men faster than expected, surprising enemies who thought they had more time. Scipio defeated Hannibal by studying his tactics and turning them against him. A Roman commander also had to be careful. Soldiers admired bravery but despised recklessness. A general who wasted lives could quickly lose the trust of his men. Some generals were even killed by their own troops when their leadership failed. At the heart of it, Roman leadership combined strict organization with personal courage. A soldier might not know the grand plan of the general, but he trusted that the chain of command would lead him through battle. In the next segment, we will step away from human leaders and look at the standards and symbols of the legions, objects that carried the pride and soul of Rome itself. Standards and symbols, the soul of the legion. Every Roman legion marched into battle carrying more than weapons and armor. They carried symbols that represented their honor, identity, and loyalty to Rome. These were the standards, tall poles topped with emblems, banners, and decorations. To the soldiers, these objects were more than just markers. They were the soul of the legion. The most important standard was the Aquila, the eagle. Made of silver or bronze, the eagle was mounted on a staff and guarded by a chosen officer called the Aquilifer. The Aquila symbolized the power of Jupiter, the chief Roman god, and the strength of Rome itself. Losing the eagle in battle was considered the worst possible disgrace. Whole campaigns were launched just to recover lost eagles, showing how much they meant to Roman pride. Alongside the eagle, each century and cohort carried its own smaller standards. These might include signa with symbols of the unit, banners of cloth, or poles decorated with wreaths, hands, or discs. They helped soldiers know where their unit was during the noise and dust of battle, serving as rallying points when lines broke apart. The men who carried these standards, the signifers, had great responsibility. They had to be brave because standards were obvious targets for the enemy. They also managed the soldiers' money, since men often trusted the signifer with their savings, kept in a small chest at camp. Protecting the standard and the soldiers' wealth tied their role to both honor and trust. In camp, standards were kept in a special shrine within the headquarters building, called the Aedes. Here, soldiers offered prayers and swore oaths of loyalty to the emperor and the legion. For them, the standards were not just military tools but sacred objects, blessed by the gods and guarded with devotion. When marching, the sight of the eagle gleaming in the sun reminded soldiers why they fought. It lifted spirits, gave direction, and bound the men together as one. To desert a standard was shameful, but to die defending it was glorious. Standards also carried history. Decorations and wreaths on a pole might show past victories. A legion's reputation could be read in the symbols attached to its standards, much like modern armies display medals and honors. For the Romans, these objects were proof that the legion was more than just a collection of men. It was a living body with a soul, traditions, and honor. The standard was that soul made visible. In the next and final segment, we will bring everything together, looking at how all these parts of the legion, the soldiers, officers, camp, tactics, and symbols, created a system so strong that it lasted for centuries. Legacy of the legion: why Rome's army endured. The Roman legion was not just a military unit, it was a system that shaped history. For centuries it defended Rome, conquered new lands, and kept the empire united. From the soldier's sandals to the general's strategy, every part of the legion worked together with discipline and purpose. This is why Rome's armies became the most famous fighting force of the ancient world. At the heart of the legion was its organization. Soldiers trained together, ate together, and lived together. This made them more than fighters, it made them brothers in arms. A legion was designed like a machine, with cohorts, centuries, and maniples all fitting together into a flexible, powerful whole. Its discipline was unmatched. A Roman soldier could march for miles, dig trenches, build a camp, and still be ready to fight. Punishments were harsh, but they kept the army steady even when fear or hunger might have broken other forces. Loyalty to the legion and to the standards gave men strength in the darkest moments. The engineering skills of the legion left their mark on the world. Roads, forts, and aqueducts built by Roman soldiers still stand today. The army was not only a tool of war but also a force of construction, spreading Roman culture, language, and order wherever it went. The command system kept everything running. Generals set the grand plan, centurions kept soldiers in line, and standards held the legion's soul. Each man knew his place, from the lowest recruit to the most powerful commander. This structure allowed the legion to fight in deserts, forests, mountains, and cities with the same efficiency. Of course, the legion was not invincible. In time, Rome faced new enemies, shifting borders, and political struggles that even the strongest army could not solve. Yet the memory of the legion outlived the empire itself. Medieval knights, modern armies, and even today's military structures borrow ideas first perfected by Rome. The legacy of the legion lies in more than battles won. It lies in the way ordinary men, organized with care, discipline, and unity, could achieve extraordinary things. From the clatter of hobnailed sandals to the gleam of the eagle in sunlight, the legion was Rome's greatest symbol of power. And so, when you think of Rome, do not imagine only marble temples or grand senators. Imagine the steady march of soldiers, the thunder of shields, the banners waving, and the discipline that carried Rome across continents. That rhythm of the legion, steady and strong, is why the Roman Empire endured for so long.